You know, when we think of a school, we generally picture this like assembly line of intellect.
Right, yeah, like a factory model.
Exactly. You send a child into this brick and mortar factory at what, age 5,
Mm.
and they move from station to station. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history.
The basics.
Right. And 12 years later, out pops this functional, well-informed adult who's ready to take on the world. The core assumption is that education is fundamentally an additive process.
Yeah, it's the architectural model of the mind. I mean, you
Hmm.
spend the early years building a solid foundation of facts,
Right.
and then you construct these walls of logic and deductive reasoning,
Right.
and finally you put a roof of critical thinking on top of all of it. The belief is that every stakeholder in that system, the teachers, the administrators, the government, they're all working in tandem toward that, architectural triumph of the individual psyche.
But then you encounter the specific body of documents and whistleblower testimonies and historical leaks, and it forces a complete reevaluation of that entire factory floor.
Oh, absolutely. It turns the whole thing upside down.
Yeah. You start to wonder, well, what if that assembly line isn't building anything at all? What if the gears were actually reversed decades ago? We might be looking at a system designed not to assemble the intellect, but to systematically, deliberately dismantle it.
Which completely inverts the paradigm. I mean, if you adopt the perspective of the sources we're looking at today, you are forced to look at falling test scores, generational anxiety, and just general societal confusion, not as a failure of the education system,
Right.
but as the system working exactly as intended. It's a chilling premise, honestly.
It really is. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome back to you listening. You're diving in with us on today's date, Wednesday, 2026, 07/29. And we are unpacking a massive, just unprecedented stack of sources today.
Massive is the right word. It's a lot to get through.
It's huge. Our mission for this deep dive is to deduce the reasoning for the radical disintegration of the mind and psyche from the school system and to figure out the ultimate goals behind this shift.
Yeah, and we have materials spanning decades to help us map this out. I mean, we're talking accounts from a senior whistleblower in the U.S. Department of Education, testimony from a defected Soviet KGB propagandist.
Which is wild, by the way.
Oh, totally wild. Plus, leaked political master plan letters and contemporary, on-the-ground critiques of modern curriculum and social engineering.
Now, we should pause right here and acknowledge something for you listening. These documents step on a lot of political landmines.
A minefield, really.
Yeah, exactly. The material touches on really raw nerves. It pokes at both left-wing and right-wing anxieties, often at the exact same time. So our goal today isn't to take a side, and we are certainly not endorsing the viewpoints presented in these documents.
Right, we're not here to validate them.
No, not at all. Our job is strictly to impartially report, synthesize, and convey the ideas contained in this original source material. We want to map out the architecture of this argument so you can judge it for yourself.
Because knowledge is most valuable when it is understood and applied. Right. And to understand this perspective, we just have to look objectively at what these authors claim is a century-long deliberate strategy. We are here to connect the dots they have laid out.
Okay, so to understand the present disintegration of the psyche, the sources suggest we can't just look at what happened yesterday. We have to look at when the very definition of the word education fundamentally changed.
Right.
And that brings us to a woman named Charlotte Thompson Iserbyt.
Yeah, Charlotte Iserbyt. She is a fascinating figure to anchor this narrative because, well, her background is deeply embedded in the traditional American establishment. She wasn't some outside agitator,
Right, she wasn't radical.
Exactly. She was a senior policy advisor in the Office of Educational Research and Improvement. This was within the U.S. Department of Education during the Ronald Reagan administration.
Her pedigree is about as elite as it gets, too. I mean, both her father and grandfather were Yale University graduates, and they were members of the Skull and Bones secret society.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's true establishment.
Yeah. She served in the State Department overseas in places like South Africa, Belgium, and South Korea. So when she speaks about the inner workings of government, she is speaking from the inside out.
And her awakening to this issue, at least according to her own detailed accounts, happened when she returned to the United States in the 1970s. She had been living out of the country for, I think, 18 years.
Right.
So she comes back to Camden, Maine, this idyllic New England town, and decides to join the local school board. But the American education system she encountered upon her return was completely alien to the one she had left in the 1950s.
She notes this specific, really jarring moment. She opens up a social studies textbook designed for first graders.
First graders, so 6-year-olds.
Yeah, 6-year-old kids. The book was called World of Mankind, published by Follett, and she finds this exercise that instructs the teacher to take the children on a walk through their town.
Which sounds innocent enough, right?
Hmm.
But the purpose of the walk is where the shift becomes glaringly apparent. The teacher isn't instructed to point out historical landmarks or, talk about municipal architecture or anything.
Yeah.
The manual tells the teacher to ask the children to identify the big houses and the little houses. And then, crucially, the teacher is supposed to ask, what do you think they eat in the big house? What do they eat in the little house?
Wait, so they aren't asking about architecture, they're prompting a 6-year-old to feel resentment.
Yes.
They're planting the seed of class consciousness. I mean, Iserbyt had lived in socialist countries overseas, and she immediately recognized this not as academic education, but as social engineering. It's a psychological prompt designed to incite class warfare in a mind that, frankly, doesn't even know how to tie its own shoes yet.
Exactly. So she goes to the school board, asks why they are spending classroom hours doing this instead of teaching phonics and basic math, and she triggers an absolute uproar.
I can imagine.
Yeah, she was essentially run up the flagpole and labeled a censor. But her investigation into that specific textbook led her to a much larger structural revelation. She tracks this massive ideological pivot to a specific watershed moment.
Which was 1965, right?
Right. The year 1965 with the passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act under Lyndon B. Johnson.
According to her research, this was the exact moment when the federal system shifted its priority away from knowledge content, meaning actual academics, facts, spelling, and history, and replaced it with performance-based behavior modification.
Behavior modification is a very clinical term, so it's important to understand the psychological mechanism at play here. The goal ceased to be about putting knowledge into a child's head so they could independently analyze the world.
Right.
The new goal was to change a child's attitudes, values, and behaviors to fit a predetermined state-sanctioned mold. This is the era where programs like values clarification and survival games were just injected into the curriculum.
The examples of these survival games in the sources are incredibly grim. I mean, they have these young children playing lifeboat exercises.
Oh, the lifeboat ones are rough.
Yeah. The teacher tells the kids, there's a nuclear war or a sinking ship. You are in a lifeboat or a bomb shelter. You have a priest, a pregnant woman, a doctor, an old man, and a young child. There isn't enough food or oxygen for everyone. You, the students, must debate and decide who lives and who is thrown out to die.
Just consider the psychological weight of that exercise on an unformed mind.
Yeah.
You're forcing a child to play God, to weigh human lives as utilitarian commodities.
Right. Assigning a value to people.
Exactly. You are demanding they assign a numeric value to a human being based on their societal utility. Like the doctor might be deemed more useful than the old man, for instance.
When parents and traditional educators found out about these morbid values clarification exercises, there was massive pushback. People were furious, obviously. So the education establishment didn't scrap the programs. According to Iserbyt, they simply rebranded them.
Right, a classic PR move.
Yeah. They started calling these exercises critical thinking.
It's a brilliant piece of marketing, honestly. But Iserbyt explicitly points out that the term critical thinking in this specific bureaucratic context traces back to Marxist dialectics.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Yeah. So it is not about formal logic, syllogisms, or deductive reasoning. It is about applying the Hegelian dialectic thesis, antithesis, synthesis directly to a child's inherited morality.
Let's break down that mechanism for a second. How does the lifeboat game actually utilize Marxist dialectics?
Okay, think of it as a process of managed cognitive dissonance. The thesis is the absolute moral value the child brings from home, which is usually rooted in family tradition or religion. Let's use the concept of stealing as an example.
Okay.
The child arrives at school believing the thesis, which is stealing is absolutely wrong.
Because their parents taught them that. It's a fixed point on their moral compass.
Exactly. Then, the school introduces the antithesis through a carefully constructed scenario. The teacher presents a lifeboat game, or a story, where a man's family is starving, and the only way to save them is to steal bread from a wealthy hoarder.
Ah, okay.
Right, so the antithesis is stealing is morally justified, perhaps even heroic, under the right conditions. The child's brain is now in a state of conflict. They are forced to reconcile the absolute rule of their parents with the nuanced, empathetic scenario provided by the state authority figure.
So they have to compromise.
Yes. The resulting synthesis is a brand new, malleable worldview, the child concludes. Sometimes stealing is wrong, but sometimes it's okay.
Wow. So it creates moral relativism. It completely unmoors them. It's like taking the label off a bottle of essential vitamins and slapping it onto a bottle of sedatives.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. The name critical thinking sounds healthy. It sounds like an intellectual vitamin, but the actual effect on the child's moral compass is entirely different. It dissolves the concept of objective right and wrong.
And by doing that, the state is deliberately severing the child from the absolute values of their family. Now, to get this radical shift implemented across thousands of decentralized school districts, you can't just mandate it from Washington, D.C.
No, local school boards would rebel instantly.
Exactly. You need people on the inside.
Yeah.
Iserbyt details how she, in her capacity as a local school board member, was invited to a special in-service training to become what the government called a change agent.
Yeah, she mentions going to this training in Maine, funded by federal grants. She thought it was going to be about administrative efficiency, but she discovers that the system was actively training educators on how to psychologically manipulate their own communities.
The training manuals explicitly detailed how to identify resistors in the community. Like if the state wanted to introduce a controversial behavior modification program, perhaps a radical death education program, or a values clarification course, they knew traditional parents would object.
Of course.
So they trained these change agents to preemptively identify the traditional parents, the outspoken citizens, the people who believed in rigorous academics, and the goal was to strategically marginalize them before they could organize a defense. They were essentially keeping dossiers on citizens.
Iserbyt said her scalp started to tingle during the training because she realized they were teaching her how to identify herself.
Right.
She was the ultimate resistor. But because of her pedigree, they assumed she was one of them. She even references this massive 3-inch thick book published in 1968 called Pacesetters in Innovation. She physically holds it up in one of our source videos. It is literally a directory of behavior modification programs designed to subtly condition children.
The sheer industrial scale of it is just daunting. I mean, the manual detailed thousands of federally funded programs. It even included line items for things like playing subliminal audio tapes on school buses.
On the buses.
Yeah, attempting to quietly alter children's values while they stared out the window on their morning commute. It was a wholesale pivot from education to psychological conditioning.
So, if you are deliberately dismantling traditional academics, if you are replacing reading and math with lifeboat games and psychological profiling, who benefits from that?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. What is the end game here? Why would an education department want a nation of uneducated, morally relative people? Well, if you look at these sources, they point to a massive underlying economic motive.
Yeah, according to the material, the ultimate goal of dismantling the intellect was never purely educational. It was economic. The objective was to transition America from a free, individualistic, free market economy into a centrally planned collectivist economy.
Iserbyt claims this economic plan goes way back, long before the 1960s. She points the finger squarely at the Carnegie Corporation, citing a specific 1934 report funded by them and put together by the American Historical Association.
Right, 1934.
Yeah, and the explicit goal stated in the report was to use the schools to mold children for a collectivized, planned economy. Why 1934? It was the Great Depression. There was a genuine fear among the elite that the free market had failed. But more importantly, the sources argue that highly educated people ask too many questions.
They do. They demand upward mobility.
Exactly. A planned state and its corporate partners don't want rugged individualists who might disrupt the system. They want compliant human capital.
That phrase, human capital, is incredibly telling. I mean, it strips the humanity, the soul, and the individuality right from the student. It reduces a child to a manageable resource, no different than a ton of coal or a barrel of oil, to be allocated by the state.
Wow.
Right. If you were going to plan an economy from the top down, you need to know exactly how many worker bees you have, and you need them to be perfectly compliant and satisfied with their predetermined station in life.
Which brings us to one of the most explosive documents in our stack today, the Mark Tucker Dear Hillary letter.
Oh, this one is wild.
It really is. This is an 18-page letter written on November 11, 1992, right after Bill Clinton won the presidency. Mark Tucker was the president of the National Center on Education and the Economy, which was a major think tank. He's writing to Hillary Clinton to lay out a master plan for the incoming administration, and the ambition of this letter is staggering.
Tucker literally writes that the goal is to remold the entire American system for human resources development. He outlines a plan to create a seamless web that extends, and this is a direct quote from the letter, from cradle to grave, and is the same system for everyone.
Cradle to grave. He's talking about fusing schools, labor, and the economy into one giant, inescapable machine.
Yes.
Tucker's plan explicitly details setting up a labor market information system. And this isn't just about recording whether a kid got a B+ in algebra. The sources reveal this involves schools scanning a child's academic, medical, mental, psychological, and behavioral data into a massive computerized database. Every child would be tracked by their social security number from the very moment they enter the system.
Just imagine the mechanics of that tracking for a second. Let's say a kid in 4th grade fidgets too much, or maybe questions the teacher's authority during a values clarification exercise.
Okay.
That behavior is coded into the database. By the time that child reaches 8th grade, that code determines what vocational track they are permitted to enter. And according to the Tucker plan, this integrated computer-based program would be accessed not just by school counselors, but by government labor boards and future corporate employers.
That's terrifying.
A psychological profile built on a child, since kindergarten, literally follows them into adulthood and dictates their employability.
To implement a system this sweeping, Tucker knew the pesky democratic process of local school boards would be a massive hurdle. I mean, parents wouldn't vote for this.
No, never.
So the plan explicitly aimed to bypass elected school boards and state legislatures entirely. How do you do that? By funneling federal funds directly to governor-appointed workforce development boards. They essentially proposed replacing local democratic control of education with unelected regional bureaucrats who take their marching orders from Washington.
It's a textbook maneuver to centralize power. If you control the funding and bypass the elected representatives, you control the curriculum. And one of the primary vehicles for enforcing this new curriculum was a proposed credential called the Certificate of Initial Mastery, or CIM.
Right, the CIM. Tucker proposed that the CIM would essentially replace the traditional high school diploma, and students would receive it around age 16. Once a student got the certificate, the plan expected that 80% of American high school graduates would be pushed into what he called sub-baccalaureate professional and technical training.
Let's define sub-baccalaureate for clarity here. It refers to education and training that goes beyond a high school diploma but falls short of a 4-year bachelor's degree. We are talking about specific trades, mid-level technicians, clerical workers, functionaries. Tucker explicitly modeled this on the German education system, which tracks students into specific vocational paths at a very young age.
Now, I have to ask the obvious question here. I can hear people listening to this and saying, wait a minute, vocational training is great. We need plumbers, we need electricians, we need IT technicians. College isn't for everyone, and it's putting kids in massive debt.
Right, that's a very fair point.
How is this Tucker plan any different from just offering really good trade schools?
The distinction made in the sources is critical, and it really comes down to the mechanism of choice. Traditional trade schools in a free, individualistic society are based on self-determination. A young person decides they want to be a mechanic because they love cars, or they want to be a plumber to start their own business and achieve upward mobility. They seek out that training to better their own life. The Tucker system, as analyzed by these sources, is fundamentally different. It uses the psychological profiling and behavioral assessments we talked about earlier to slot children into specific tracks.
They are slotting them not based on what the child desires, but based on what the regional corporations and the state economy dictate they need.
Exactly. It eliminates individual choice and upward mobility by design. If the Regional Workforce Development Board determines the local economy needs, say, 5,000 mid-level solar panel technicians over the next decade, the school system is tasked with producing exactly 5,000 compliant technicians.
Wow.
It treats children as planned widgets in a corporate state monopoly. The student is no longer being educated to be a free-thinking citizen capable of holding their government accountable, reading philosophy, or changing careers. They are being trained to be a fixed human resource for the global economy.
So we have this massive domestic push for a planned economy happening inside the U.S. Department of Education, funded by major think tanks and foundations. But while these domestic bureaucrats were pushing this in the 80s and 90s, our geopolitical rivals weren't just sitting back and watching.
Oh, definitely not.
The sources argue a foreign psychological war was simultaneously targeting the American mind, capitalizing on the exact vulnerabilities the school system was creating.
And this brings us to the testimony of Yuri Bezmenov and the KGB playbook. Bezmenov's perspective provides the geopolitical overlay to Iserbyt's domestic discoveries. He was a Soviet defector. He was the son of a high-ranking Soviet army officer, educated in elite Soviet schools, and eventually recruited by the KGB to work as a propagandist for the Novosti press agency.
His defection story in 1970 is wild, by the way.
It sounds like a movie.
It does. He was stationed in India, grew entirely disillusioned with the brutality of the Soviet regime, and to escape the KGB and the Indian police who were collaborating with them, he dressed up as an American hippie, complete with a wig, beads, and sandals.
That's amazing.
He literally joined a group of stoners on a bus tour to sneak out of the country. But what he revealed to the CIA and later to the public completely shatters how we view the mechanics of the Cold War.
It really does. Our cultural understanding of the KGB is dominated by the James Bond image, right?
Yeah.
Spies, stealing nuclear secrets, dead drops, microfilms, assassinations.
Yeah, cloak and dagger stuff.
But Bezmenov explicitly states that only about 15% of KGB resources went to that kind of traditional espionage. A staggering 85% of their time, money, and manpower went to what he calls ideological subversion or psychological warfare.
Psychological warfare. They realized you don't need to drop bombs if you can just drop ideas. Bezmenov defines ideological subversion as an overt, open process to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite an abundance of true information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions to defend themselves, their families, or their country.
It is the geopolitical equivalent of gaslighting. You destroy the target's epistemological foundation, their ability to know what is true. And Bezmenov breaks this process down into 4 distinct chronological stages.
Okay, let's go through them.
The first and most crucial stage is called demoralization. According to Bezmenov, this stage takes exactly 15 to 20 years to execute.
15 to 20 years. Wait, that's exactly how long it takes for a child to go from kindergarten through college.
Precisely. You cannot demoralize an adult who already has a formed worldview. You have to start with the children. The goal of the 15 to 20-year demoralization stage is to pump Marxist-Leninist ideology, or at the very least, severe moral relativism, into the soft, unformed heads of students.
Right.
And you do this while actively preventing them from being counterbalanced by the basic values of American constitutionalism, patriotism, or traditional morality.
Let's explicitly link this timeline for a second. If Bezmenov is talking about a 15 to 20-year process peaking in the 1960s and 70s, that matches up perfectly with Charlotte Iserbyt's timeline.
It perfectly aligned.
She saw the curriculum shift in 1965 away from academics to behavior modification. The KGB was relying on the very mechanisms, the values clarification, the removal of absolute truth that domestic educators were installing.
The convergence is chilling. Iserbyt identified the mechanism inside the schools. Bezmenov describes the overarching geopolitical strategy that was weaponizing that mechanism. Bezmenov stated publicly in the 1980s that the process of demoralization in America was already completed and overfulfilled.
Overfulfilled, wow.
Yeah. The generation educated in the 60s had, by the 80s, occupied positions of power in government, civil service, business, and mass media. They were fundamentally programmed to react to stimuli in a certain pattern.
He talks about the cognitive dissonance of the demoralized person. He says that once a person is fully demoralized, you cannot change their mind. Even if you shower them with authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, they will refuse to believe it. Their brain literally cannot process facts that contradict their programmed reality.
Once demoralization is complete, the subsequent stages happen rapidly. Stage 2 is destabilization, which takes only 2 to 5 years. This involves attacking the core pillars of a nation, its economy, its foreign relations, and its defense systems. You fund radical groups, you encourage societal friction, you make the populace feel like the system is fundamentally broken and unsalvageable.
Then comes stage 3, right, crisis.
Yes, crisis. This takes only up to 6 weeks. It's a rapid, violent change of power, structure, and economy. A spark ignites the destabilized society, leading to mass riots or collapse of the government, forcing the panicked population to beg for a strong man to step in and restore order.
Which leads to the final, most cynical stage in the KGB playbook, normalization. This is a term borrowed from actual Soviet propaganda. When Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia in 1968 to brutally crush democratic dissent, the Kremlin proudly declared the situation normalized.
Right.
In this stage, the new totalitarian rulers consolidate power. And what happens to the radical leftists, the Marxist professors, the civil rights defenders who spent decades helping destabilize the country?
Well, Bezmenov says they're lined up against the wall and shot.
Brutal.
Yeah. The KGB had a specific term for them: useful idiots. Once the revolution is won, the new dictators know that these idealistic intellectuals will eventually realize they've been duped. When the utopian promises fail to materialize, these same activists will turn against the new regime. So the state executes the very people who helped them get into power.
To accelerate this subversion, Bezmenov detailed how the KGB aggressively targeted American intellectuals, journalists, and politicians, treating them as primary vectors for spreading demoralization. He worked at the Novosti press agency, where his literal day job was to act as a handler for visiting foreign dignitaries.
And the sources show historical pictures of him doing this. In 1967, Look magazine sent a dozen prominent journalists to the USSR to write a cover story on the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. Bezmenov says his specific instruction was to keep them permanently intoxicated from the moment they landed.
Wow, just keep them drunk.
Exactly. He would take these drunk, happy American journalists on tours of Siberia and show them a typical Soviet kindergarten with plump children playing with toys. But the reality, Bezmenov says that specific facility was a prison for the children of political dissidents.
That's horrifying.
Right. The journalists either didn't know or their ideological bias made them not care to ask. They went back to America and printed a massive package of glowing propaganda to the American public.
It wasn't just journalists either. The KGB targeted cultural figures and politicians. Bezmenov describes Senator Ted Kennedy visiting and dancing at a staged Soviet wedding, completely oblivious to the fact that the entire room was packed with KGB operatives with security clearances, instructed exactly on what to say to create a false impression of a thriving Soviet middle class.
And then there is the strangest detail in Bezmenov's account. He talks about the KGB closely tracking and promoting Eastern gurus, specifically people like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the guy who taught the Beatles and various Hollywood stars how to meditate.
Yeah, that part tripped me up. Why would Soviet intelligence care about a meditation guru?
Because it served the demoralization agenda perfectly.
Yeah.
Think about the psychological utility of that movement in the context of the Cold War. If you can convince millions of young, able-bodied, educated Americans to sit down, look at their navels, smoke marijuana, and meditate on cosmic oneness rather than engage in real critical political issues or defend their country's interest, you effectively neutralize a massive portion of the population.
Oh, wow. It's like a computer virus that doesn't destroy your files but slowly rewrites your operating system so you eventually hand over your passwords willingly.
That's a perfect analogy. You isolate them from reality into a bubble of non-involvement. The KGB viewed these spiritual seekers as incredibly useful idiots contributing to the pacification of the American mind.
But to make demoralization stick permanently, to make a child truly reliant on the state and susceptible to this kind of subversion, there is one massive barrier standing in the way. The state has to overcome the nuclear family.
Right.
And that brings us to the sources detailing how the system attempts to sever the roots of the child.
If a totalitarian system wants complete, unquestioning loyalty from the individual, it must inevitably sever the child's loyalty to their parents. The nuclear family is the natural enemy of the state because it provides an independent moral compass, it provides alternative history, and it offers a private support structure that doesn't rely on the government.
We see this expressed openly by modern advocates. The sources cite a quote from a public education advocate stating plainly, "We have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities."
That phrasing, kids belong to whole communities, is a direct echo of the collectivist mindset we explored with the Carnegie Report. It reframes the child not as a product of a family lineage, but as the literal property of the state.
Yeah.
We also see the psychological blueprint for this in the writings of Dr. Brock Chisholm, who was the first Director General of the World Health Organization. In a famous 1945 speech, he recommended that the path to world peace required getting rid of conscience.
Getting rid of conscience.
Yes, and how do you eliminate conscience? Through the schools. He advocated using early education to free children from the moral strictures and religious dogmas imposed by their parents.
They want to replace logical, inherited morality with raw emotion. Our sources highlight a specific, deeply unsettling exercise given to elementary school teachers. The lesson plan tells the teacher to have children write letters to their parents demanding new balls and jump ropes for recess.
Right.
But it's not an exercise in logical persuasion. The teacher is instructed to write 3 words on the chalkboard: anger, fear, joy.
Break down the psychology of what the teacher does next. The teacher guides these young, impressionable children to craft sentences specifically designed to agitate their parents emotionally. Instead of teaching the child to say, I would like a ball because physical exercise is good for me,
Yeah.
the curriculum encourages phrases like, my mom nags me,
Yeah.
or expressing exaggerated sadness to induce guilt.
They are literally training young children to view their parents as antagonists.
Yeah.
They are teaching them that to navigate the world and get what you want, you don't use smacks, you don't use logic, and you don't use respectful dialogue. You use emotional manipulation. The educational publisher is actively trying to marginalize the parent-child relationship right inside the classroom.
And when you bypass logic and rely entirely on emotional manipulation, the mind becomes incredibly vulnerable to indoctrination. If a child is taught that their feelings are the only valid metric of truth, they have no defense against a state that knows how to manipulate those feelings.
Which opens the door for all kinds of programming.
Exactly. And the contemporary sources in our stack provide staggering examples of how this emotional overload is being deployed to rewrite history.
The sources refer to this as the Great Indoctrination. In Philadelphia, a group called Working Educators organized a training for 100 public school teachers to infuse radical racial and systemic politics into their classrooms. For the youngest kids, we're talking kindergartners, they handed out Black Lives Matter propaganda coloring books.
The medium here is the message. Teaching young kids about complex, highly debated sociological concepts like systemic oppression and white privilege through a coloring book, a medium meant for simple fun and play, creates a cognitive short circuit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It induces a heightened, polarized awareness of race at an age where developmental psychology tells us children are largely colorblind and focused on basic socialization.
It gets darker as the kids get older, too. The sources discuss a program in Philadelphia where 8th graders were given a list of heroic women to profile for history class. One of the women prominently featured on this list was Willa Garimati.
Okay, who is she?
Well, the sources point out that she is a woman who publicly claimed that white men invented the AIDS virus specifically to kill off African Americans.
Wow.
Yeah, this is who 13-year-olds in 60 public schools were being taught to revere as a historical hero. They are being fed radical, divisive conspiracy theories, and it is being framed by the authority of the school as absolute historical fact.
You see the mechanics of Bezmenov's destabilization stage perfectly executed here. You are teaching the next generation that their society is fundamentally irredeemably evil. We also have the example of a school in a wealthy Minnesota suburb following the 2016 election of Donald Trump.
Oh, this one was crazy.
The school descended into institutional hysteria. Students reported teachers crying hysterically in class, with one teacher comparing the Democratic election to the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The school then implemented an 11th grade literature course, explicitly requiring students to analyze texts through Marxist, feminist, and post-colonial lenses.
The atmosphere described in these sources was so rigid that teachers were holding what can only be described as self-criticism sessions in a 10th grade AP history class. This is straight out of Mao's Cultural Revolution.
It really is.
The teacher called out students suspected of being Trump supporters and demanded they publicly assure the class they weren't racists. It's enforced ideological rigidity through public humiliation.
And if you are a student trapped in that environment, how do you survive it? You seek out an ally. You seek out a friend. Which brings us to perhaps the most psychologically insidious tactic mentioned in the sources: the push by some modern psychologists and school administrators to abolish the concept of having a best friend.
I have to admit, when I first read this in the SAC, I was deeply confused. The sources cite an article by a prominent psychologist endorsing efforts in the US and Europe to actively stop kids from having a single best friend, encouraging them instead to run in larger packs or groups, allegedly to avoid cliques and hurt feelings.
Right. On the surface, it uses the language of empathy. We just want everyone to be included. But if you apply the analytical lens we've been building throughout this deep dive, the sociological motive is deeply authoritarian. Think about the function of a best friend in a child's life.
Well, a best friend is a confidant. It's the person you whisper to in the back of the class. It's a private sanctuary. If the teacher is up front saying something insane or forcing a self-criticism session, a best friend is the person you make eye contact with across the room and you silently communicate, "This is crazy, right?"
Exactly. A best friend provides a reality check. They validate your independent perception of reality. It is a micro-rebellion against the collective. By abolishing best friends and forcing children into supervised collective packs, you destroy that private sphere.
Wow.
You prevent individuals from forming one-on-one alliances against the collective narrative. The state, or the collective pack managed by the state, must be the child's only true friend.
If you severed their ties to history, to their parents, and to their close friends, what is left to sever? The sources argue there is one final frontier. The ultimate disintegration of the psyche isn't just about politics or economics. It's about destroying the child's foundational grip on physical, biological reality itself.
We are talking about the recent massive explosion of gender identity ideology in schools. The sources note a sudden top-down cultural shift, pinpointing the 2014 Time magazine cover featuring the Vern Cox, which proclaimed a transgender tipping point.
Right.
The authors of our sources argue this wasn't an organic grassroots movement, but a highly organized ideology dropped fully formed into the culture and rapidly enforced in elementary schools.
The examples provided are relentless. We have PTA presidents doing drag routines in front of 5-year-olds. We have schools reading books like Jacob's New Dress to first graders without notifying the parents. We have coloring books featuring Tony the tampon being used to de-gender female biological processes, actively trying to convince children that men get periods too.
What alarms the authors of these sources most is the deliberate, systemic bypassing of parental consent. They highlight policies in places like California and Australia, where schools are actively facilitating the gender transition of children as young as 6.
6 years old.
Yes. They allowed the child to use different names, pronouns, and use different bathrooms at school, while the administration actively hides this information from the parents.
How does a school legally or ethically justify keeping something that massive from a parent?
They utilize linguistic loopholes. They classify these transitions under tolerance and diversity curricula rather than sex education, which usually requires parental opt-in. Or, in the case of Australia, they invoke a legal concept called duty of care for the student's well-being.
Duty of care, interesting.
Yeah, by claiming the parents might not be perfectly affirming, the school effectively declares a 6-year-old a mature minor capable of making life-altering decisions without parental input. The state literally steps in as the surrogate parent.
But the medical community isn't entirely monolithic on this, right? The sources quote, "The American College of Pediatricians releasing a stark statement calling this entire process child abuse." They warn about the irreversible damage of puberty blockers, the lifetime of carcinogenic cross-sex hormones, and the surgical amputation of healthy body parts on minors.
And this is where we have to ask the critical question on behalf of the listener. Advocates for these programs argue passionately that this is simply about anti-bullying. It's about making marginalized kids feel safe and preventing suicide.
Right, that's the prevailing narrative.
So why do the sources we are reading today claim this is part of a nefarious overarching plot?
It's the ultimate question of motive. And the expert analysis in our sources provides a truly chilling answer. They claim this isn't about civil rights or protecting children at all. It is about breaking down the very concept of a binary, objective reality. Think about it. What is the most fundamental, observable truth a child learns about the physical world?
That there are men and women. That biological sex is an immutable physical reality rooted in mammalian reproduction. I mean, if you dig up a human skeleton in 500 years, the DNA in the marrow will clearly indicate male or female.
Right. So if the school system can successfully convince a 5-year-old that their physical, biological reality is an illusion that a boy can magically become a girl just by feeling like one, and that language must bend to accommodate that feeling, then you have completely shattered that child's reliance on objective truth.
That makes total sense.
If physical reality is subjective, then everything is subjective. A mind that has been successfully severed from the evidence of its own physical body is completely open to any programming the state wants to install.
It is the ultimate final synthesis of the Marxist dialectic we discussed earlier with the lifeboat games. Thesis: biological reality exists and is observable. Antithesis: your internal feelings contradict biology. Synthesis: biology is a social construct that can be discarded.
Wow.
You have created a human being utterly dependent on the state and the changing whims of language to tell them what is real. And the sources take this to an incredibly esoteric, almost science fiction level conclusion.
Yeah, this part is where the scope of the theory truly expands. They connect this breakdown of physical reality to a deeper spiritual and technological goal: transhumanism, the idea of merging humans with technology.
The sources outline a philosophy among global elites, where the ultimate goal is to function beyond the biological constraints of the human body. They speak of a future where human brains are integrated with quantum biological computers. The destruction of gender and physical identity in children is seen by these authors as a necessary psychological preparatory step for migrating humanity into a virtual metaverse.
If physical reality is obsolete, If you are taught that you don't even have a fixed body, then soaring across a digital virtual landscape becomes the new preferred existence. You go from being an active creator in your physical, tangible life to a passive consumer in a state-controlled digital universe.
It is the ultimate form of compliance.
A mind totally divorced from nature, trapped in a digital box built by the state, working the exact job the Mark Tucker database assigned to you in the 4th grade.
It is a dizzying, terrifying projection of the future. But if you trace the historical line laid out in these documents, from Charlotte Iserbyt's discovery of the 1965 shift, from academics to behavior modification, to Mark Tucker's cradle-to-grave planned workforce, to Yuri Bezmenov's stages of ideological demoralization, to the deliberate severing of the family bond, and finally the destruction of biological reality, it presents a grim, highly unified theory of modern education.
So let's pull all of this together. According to the massive stack of sources we've just unpacked, the disintegration of the mind in the school system is not a series of unfortunate accidents. It isn't the result of well-meaning but failed bureaucratic policies.
No, not at all.
The move from rigorous academics to emotional manipulation, the deliberate severing of family ties, and the shattering of biological reality are presented as a deliberate, century-long strategy.
And the end goal of this strategy: to produce a demoralized, unmoored, compliant human resource, a population stripped of absolute morals, devoid of historical context, and separated from family loyalty, perfectly primed to be slotted seamlessly into a global, collectivist planned economy.
It brings us right back to the beginning. We think of schools as an assembly line, building the intellect piece by piece. The prevailing narrative is that the factory is just a little broken and needs more funding. But these sources argue that the factory isn't broken at all.
Right.
It was successfully retooled decades ago to disassemble the mind.
It challenges everything we take for granted about how our society functions, how we view our institutions, and how we arrived at this current moment of intense cultural polarization and cognitive dissonance.
Which leads me to a final, provocative thought for you to mull over, something to take with you long after this audio stops playing. If the educational system was fundamentally redesigned decades ago to produce behavioral compliance rather than genuine intellect, we have to ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. How much of what we consider our own adult independent thinking is actually just the successful execution of 20th century programming that we don't even remember receiving?
It's the kind of question that forces you to examine the foundation of your own mind.
Have a great week. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.